spending and had 6 calls yesterday. I was on the phone for 8 hours and 45 minutes yesterday, to the chagrin of my spouse and toddler. But it's been, I know and I feel that it has been a very concerning, worrisome time, as for the first time we're not able to be in and practicing. And while we're now seeing a lot of states and provinces starting to slowly start to reopen and move things forward, you're not alone. And it's very important that you're using this time to plan on growth and how we're going to get through it and how we're going to not only survive, but thrive through it. So I'm going to share some of the best practices over the past few weeks that we've seen dealing with landlords, as well as with lease reviews, let it be expansions, relocations. You know, many of you might be thinking, calls we've had recently, my rent is astronomically high. You know, I was on the phone with a doctor the other day, 23% of annual collections was going towards tenancy expense. That is double, almost triple the national average. So with all of this, it's created a unique opportunity to be rethinking about, where do I want to be practicing? What does my future practice need to look like? And what do I want my financials to look like, and to ensure that the lease is aligned with those goals? So really, I truly, again, appreciate our time together. The Q&A section is open. My name is Eric Pook, Managing Director here at Cirrus Consulting Group. For those of you with leases in hand or any questions, you can reach us directly through to schedule a complimentary lease review, which we'll touch on, or rental rate analysis report through either of those core channels. And there'll be more information and some polls as we go through today. For those of you that have never joined us before, thank you. Thank you for that. We appreciate that. Well, we are unique. We are the only healthcare tenant representation firm of our kind in North America. And what does that mean? That means that this is all we do. For 26 years, we have been focused on representing doctors in the negotiation of their commercial office leases. So funny, I've got a call on with a Northern California doctor on Saturday morning, and he said, you know what, I not only have I never heard of you guys, but it's I can't believe I haven't been aware that a firm like yours exists. And he only wished that he'd heard of us decades prior when he signed his last lease, which obviously has a number of issues with it. So from that perspective, we're unique, right? That our team is comprised of commercial real estate attorneys on staff that just focus on office leases, and specifically for dentists. In addition, we've hired those from the national landlords. So those that used to negotiate against dentists, we've hired them on board from the dark side, if you will. And then also, of course, we have those that have also come and been with us negotiating leases for doctors now for over 17 years with us through our 26-year history. So an incredible amount of history and experience from that perspective. We've done over 12,000 leases. We do, hundreds of these continuing education courses. And, as again, I said, luckily, the numbers have come down, but even at the Javits Center in New York, I was at the booth not long ago, talking to many of you throughout the process, and unbelievable how a few months have changed. But luckily, we're seeing the positive. Governments are now talking about reopening and strategies. So it's, again, it is a pivotal time that through this uncertainty, we're finding this is an incredible amount of time to be able to assist and to be renegotiating leases and rents, while the landlords are going through a very nervous run as well. As much as you are concerned about the future and viability of your practice, I can assure you that landlords, especially the smaller ones that are heavily leveraged, are receiving a ton of pressure from banks and otherwise, trying to figure out when restaurants and pubs and nail salons are unable to make their rent payments, are very concerned in terms of how they're going to survive through it. So you, being a dental tenant, I cannot stress enough, are in my opinion, the best commercial real estate tenant on the planet. And so many calls I've had with many of you over the past few weeks are of this opinion that, oh, the landlord's just going to get another 13 dentists in after me and I have no leverage. That couldn't be further from the truth, right? You, right, as an occupation, have an incredibly low default rate, less than 0.5%. Right? Also, you have the highest build-out costs of any other tenant on the planet, really, right? You're building out at $100, $200 per square foot, all the medical grade plumbing, electrical, etc. All of that becomes property of the landlord. And of course, in addition to that, there's also now the aspect of the fact that for usually the practice is there for over 26 years on average. Please, as one takeaway from today, realize that you, right, have a far more amount of leverage than you may anticipate. So from that perspective, a couple of quick questions that just came in. Will you comment on what I think about the federal government program for rent assistance announced on Friday and what that will look like? And then follow up, that was a question. So yeah, I'm happy to touch on some of the geographic specific. I believe you're referring to the CECRA. So we'll touch on those here momentarily. The short answer is that from our guidance, we've been involved principally with help to use some of the different industry boards of trades and liaising with them and doing some proactive to help get some legislation and other things passed specifically for Canada, where we're seeing now the landlord community starting to help to assist with structuring assistance for landlords, and not dissimilar to other programs that we're seeing throughout the US right now, where if the landlord is getting a benefit or subsidy from the government to reduce their cost, they should not be using that as an opportunity to build up their cash war chest and bank accounts. They should be passing that on to tenants. So arguably our services have never been needed now more than ever, because we have to make sure that, let it be the CECRA or other sort of processes, we have to make sure that we are getting the benefit passed on to us properly through lease amending agreement. So we'll touch on some of those as we go. Keep those questions coming. Happy to answer them as we go. A couple of key numbers though. If this is your first webinar, 85% of dentists have a their practice. What do we mean by that? In the assignment and subletting section, for those of you following along, that dictates if and how, A, you're able to sell your practice. And of course, it's required when you sell your practice, you must transfer the lease agreement. Without the lease, without the location, what's your practice worth? So the lease then becomes critical component to selling or transferring your practice, and conditions and other aspects that the landlord can do that can impact the sale of your practice. Another big one is 54% of dentists or groups are overpaying in rent today. Why is that? Well, because unfortunately, so many doctors today are just so busy with the practices that when it comes up for rent renewal, they forget about their critical dates. They might have even missed their requirement to notify the landlord with within the 6 or 12 months prior to the lease expiring to exercise their option. So in order to renew the lease, you have to give the landlord proper notification. We'll spend more time talking on that today. But 54% of you are overpaying because you're not reaching out to a real estate partner. You're not getting the information in terms of comparables, vacancies, rental rates. You're not having the data to fight back against the landlord. Landlord comes back and says, hey, market price is $40 a square foot. And what are you going to do? Oh, geez, 35 sounds a lot better, right? Well, the landlords know this, so they're going to start high and they're going to do a little back and forth, and they're hoping that you're not going to spend any time looking at the other 45 to 55 other pages of stuff in the lease agreement, which candidly could have impacts of hundreds of thousands of dollars for your practice. And the third is, and again, for many of you contemplating sale, right, there's many things like a consideration language in the lease. That specifically means that if in the event you're selling and profiting from the sale of your practice and the transferring of the lease, the landlord may have language in your lease today that allows them to collect a percentage or all of the proceeds from the sale and therefore transferring of your lease agreement. Now, I see a flurry of Q&As and hand raises and people getting very angry at that. So that is the consideration language, again, in the assignment section for those of you following along in your leases. So the purpose of today, a couple of core components. First of all is everyone's situation is unique. So I'll be giving lots of case studies and some recent anecdotes of examples and calls we've had because I think they're relevant and they might hit home with many of you. So the way we're going to do that is to touch on 4 different critical areas to be aware of the lease, right? So we'll do some practical, again, for those of you following along with your lease, we'll go through some examples. Also share our view of the current economic climate and what we're hearing from doctors throughout North America. And then of course, cash flow, right? If cash flow was a problem in April, it's a big problem for May. And hopefully everyone has made April rent payments. If not, we may have made the problem worse. If you have received some sort of an email or a property manager as an aside had made some sort of a side deal or suggestion to pay what you can, we have to now fast make sure that whatever deferral, abatement, rent relief, all of that has to be properly documented in the form of a lease amendment or otherwise, that whatever has been proposed, it has to be captured and documented so that the landlord cannot go back after you if, months down the line, they say, you remember when you skipped April? Well, you know what, that's a problem now because we didn't actually fully agree to that, nor did we change the terms in the lease. So we have to make sure that that's done. A couple of other questions here that just cropped up. If I'm not an existing client with your firm, what would be my cost to negotiate my lease with the landlord? Let me circle back on that one. Everyone is unique depending on the scope of the project. First step is I would suggest, Dr. Deferrals, to look at to submit your lease, and we will certainly go through and do a complimentary lease review for all those on the line, and then we'll be able to determine scope from that perspective. All right, so in addition to that, we'll touch on landlord strategies. What's working, what's not? What are the large open to doing? What are the smaller ones doing? We're happy to share some best practices on that front. And then also for those of you, and many of you, improvements or alterations in the space, or to certainly make some improvements, add some gear. It is an unprecedented opportunity now to be renegotiating with the landlords to help achieving those, and maybe even getting some additional value in terms of tenant improvements or preferred rates. So let's jump in. Again, for those of you with the lease in front of you, as we go through the conversation, here's some of the first things that we look at. Number one is the lease terms. So ask yourself, when does the lease expire? Look through the lease agreement. Unfortunately, many landlords hide this by saying it's based on a commencement date that is not clarified as to when that specifically starts. But look at the term, look about when the lease had commenced or when you last exercised your option to renew, and when does that lease expire. Now, why is that important? Well, other than the obvious reasons, it's important because it determines how much leverage you have. If you're 1 year into a 10-year term, and we're asking for all sorts of things from the landlord and asking for all improvements and to reopen the lease, it's unlikely. Landlords have already booked that revenue and receivables and are assuming that's coming in regardless. So it's important to know when you expire, because especially those on the line that may be expiring in the next 2 years, 1 year, 2.5 years, or heaven forbid, if you're in a month-to-month situation, pivotal that we're very cautious about next steps, and very important that now you look at today as an opportunity to be renewing that lease, to structure a new long-term term with options, to make sure that you have the continuity and predictability, to make sure that when you're ready to get back into the office and start working, there is nothing going to impact your ability to be in that space. So that's number one. Number two is, do you have any options to renew? Option is good for the tenant. It basically states that you have the ability to choose to stay in the space and renew the lease principally for another 5 years or 2 5-year options. But unfortunately, it usually states that you agree to everything in the current lease agreement, as well as everything with the exception of rent. And for the lease that I was reviewing this morning, it states that you agree to not only everything in the lease, but also that the rent must be higher, either at the fair market price or at an increased rate. Usually you're 10 or 15% more than what the current lease price is. So whatever the greater the value. So that's a problem. So that's why in many cases we advise to complete negotiations prior to that option to renew deadline. Why? It gives you more leverage, right? If you can negotiate the new deal, then the option is sort of the back pocket worst case scenario. So a huge takeaway, can't stress enough for the few hundred of you on the line today, is that very important that the earlier you engage the landlord in communications, let it be for a month defer, for May or June, or for a renewal strategy, the more time, the better. The longer you wait, that's the landlord's play. They're going to wait as long as possible. And then they know that, if the lease is expiring a month or 3 months from now, how are you going to relocate? It can be upwards of 18 months to relocate a dental practice. So use that time frame to your advantage. So when does your option expire? The next one, very critical. Amongst doctors now that have signed the lease in their name personally. So look on the first page. When it says tenant, does it say Dr. Jim Smith, DDS, right? Or does it say, Dr. Jane Brown, DDS, PC, or LLC? Is it in your corporation or is it in your name personally? For those of you that are looking and it's in your name personally, that yields another set of challenges and exposure to yourself, meaning that the landlord has committed and has your commitment personally, not your corporation. So in the event of any dispute or issues, the landlord can come after you personally and any personal assets. So one of the strategies that we're doing with doctors today is through the upcoming renewal, we're also removing the doctor personally and in place putting in your corporation. That is very prudent, because again, if any disputes or missed payments or otherwise, you've now left yourself personally exposed. Now, so as we're going through the capital preservation exercise and we're looking at the bank accounts and we've laid off our staff and we're waiting on the PPP loans, etc., what do we do next? Well, now, as many of you have realized, the second major expense is tenancy expense. How much we're paying to the landlord. And we've seen the full gambit. Oh my gosh. We've seen some landlords, you're not going to believe it, sent a letter 2 days into the COVID issues and some of the state of emergencies and stated that, Dr. Namal stated, we saw that you're closed and we know COVID-19 is going on and it's a terrible thing. But we see that you're closed, and per the continuous operation clause in your lease, you are responsible regardless for being open through Monday through Friday, right, from 9 to 5, and Saturday from 12 to 5. And use that to then say, we're now finding you in material breach of your lease agreement, and here's all the terrible things we're about to do to you. Can you imagine? So how devastating is that the landlords are, in some cases, not all, but are using this as an opportunity to hold the tenant in default, to either then, as we'll touch on, to either kick them out of the space or to bring in another tenant or to raise rents. I mean, I digress. In addition, we've seen also landlords that are very forthcoming in saying that we're willing to offer 2 months of deferrals. And here's the upcoming 6-page lease amending agreement to put that into place. Now, in some cases, those lease amending agreements might also be referencing to other terms and might have some other impacts to the lease. So make sure that you're having someone professionally review it prior to signing. And then in addition, very important that you're strategizing to be proactive. So for example, if you've been contemplating expanding, if you've been contemplating alterations, if you've been contemplating, reaching out to the landlord to renewing your lease, you want to be proactive and creating what that looks like in terms of financials, business, and otherwise. So in terms of the considerations, with the lease in front of you, are you a gross tenant, meaning everything's included in one set monthly payments? Are you a modified gross, meaning it maybe doesn't include taxes and a few other insurance perhaps? And then are you a triple net, meaning you pay a base rent plus, right? Anything in additional. So in many cases, we're successful in getting the base rent deferred, but usually the landlord still wants the common area maintenance to be passed on and paid because they're incurring those expenses. They're reaching out from certain cities where let it be Southern California or certain elements of Toronto or otherwise, where the cities are offering the landlords a property tax deferral, then you should also have the opportunity to be getting the benefit. So if the landlord doesn't have to pay property taxes, fees still be $2,500 when in fact the landlord's not bearing that expense. A few other components here. What are your other obligations? What is your total payment to the landlord, right? How much are you paying today? So look in your accounting software or practice management software to find out exactly how much you're paying today. Other good questions are, what is the rentable versus usable square footage? So for any of you that are now confused or haven't been able to find a number of these aspects, please email us a copy of your lease with any background and relevant details to info@cirrusconsultinggroup.com, and our team will help to coordinate a time and to review the lease on a complimentary basis on your behalf to help out during these uncertain times. Now, the next big one is when we're talking about default. So ask yourself now, have you made April's rent payment? Have you made it in full? Did you make it on time? Right. So the goal in our guidance is that, first of all, if you can make your rent payment, make your rent payment. Because if you don't, and you don't have approval to do so, then we can be having a large amount of unintended consequences, and you might be impacting your future leverage to renegotiate with the landlord. So what do I mean by that? Well, again, if you're in your lease agreement, flip ahead to the default provision, right, of which it's typically will state that if in the event we don't make a rent payment within a certain number of days, the landlord can then find us in default, and then there can be a list of impacts that they can do to remedy. First of all, they might not even have to tell you. You might be in default today and the landlord doesn't need to notify you. If they do notify you, you may or may not have a cure or remedy period, meaning that a time to meet the obligations so you're no longer found in default. So again, be cautious about and review what's in that default provision, because it can be very, very detrimental. Number one, we could lose our options to remain in the space, meaning by exercising those options, we have the ability to stay for another 5 or 10 years. However, it states that in the lease, that if we are in default or have ever been in default, those options to stay become null and void. And now we've given up that 10 years of predictability, and we've left now the viability or future of our practice squarely in the hands of the landlord. Or even worse, landlord's 3D, landlord termination right. If in the event that we are in default, the landlord might be able to put a brown envelope on our door and state, here's your notice in 30 days that we are, based on your inability to pay rent, we are finding you in default and you're out, right? And they have a termination right. Now, some of you might be saying, well, look, in COVID-19, Eric, you just said we've got lots of landlord. Why would the landlord want us out? Well, there could be a few reasons. There could be another tenant, right? It could be a large coffee chain. It could be a large DSO. Maybe someone's been eyeing your beautiful practice for quite some time, and they see this as a great opportunity to be negotiating with the landlord to pay a little bit more of a rent premium and to suddenly now have access to a fully built-out practice. Right? So again, we are going into very uncertain times, and it's important that your lease is going to dictate how much protection you have as we see a lot of things that we've never seen before come through. Right? We're seeing, landlords that are running into financial challenges. We're going to see developers gobbling up a lot of buildings that they've been eyeing for a while and can now get a discount. We're seeing doctors selling their practice that are now willing to take a significant decrease in purchase price because of some of the uncertainty and some of the ramp up and the impact of productions. So again, very uncertain times, important that you're surrounding your professional team with those to give you guidance to help share and create some of those best practices. So let's touch on a few other components here, other terms and conditions in the lease. Guarantee, I won't ask for a raise of hands for that one, but have you signed yourself personally, or you and your spouse might be jointly and severally liable? In some cases, we've seen even family members, right? Brothers, sisters, and brothers-in-laws as personal guarantors, meaning that if your practice comes into harm's way, and either you're in default or you've missed payments, then you personally or your family could be responsible for coming up with that amounts of money, or for any performance within the lease or any damages. So we've really left, depending on how that was structured, it is negotiable, especially for those of you that are 5 or 10 years into your term and you've shown you've paid rent on time. These things we have a very high success rate in getting removed or limiting. But for those of you that have in your leases today, we have to create a plan on how to limit that exposure moving forward. Because there's no reason that, for a 30, 20, 10 year practicing doctor, that the landlord has so many different hooks into us when we've proven that we're a fantastic tenant. In addition, exclusivity. If you are the only dentist allowed in the mall, then you may be losing the ability to have that exclusivity by missing that rent payment or being in default. Another lot of questions recently, and we'll go to some questions here in just a moment, is what happens if my landlord goes bankrupt? And we've had a lot of those. So in your lease agreement, you should have a specific section referred to as a non-disturbance or subordination, an SDNA agreement. And what that does is, in essence, it lets your lease be subordinate to the mortgage. So if the landlord goes bankrupt and the bank takes over, the bank can't rewrite all the leases on whatever terms they'd like. So it's important that your lease is subordinate to the mortgage. And then last but not least, the ability to sell your practice. That is in the assignment and subletting section. That is the one that if there's one section to read and read multiple times, that's it. That's going to determine if you can have an associate or a 1099 or independent contractor working in your practice. That will also determine whom you can sell the practice to. That will also determine that you cannot sell your practice without the prior written consent of your landlord. It'll also describe that when you do transfer the lease, that the landlord might need 4 months worth of base rent payments as security deposit. Or for many of you, you will be continually liable upon sale of the practice, meaning that even after you sell, your personal guarantees and your corporate guarantee, your liability will remain unchanged even after you've sold the practice. So that's akin to, signing, you're in Chicago and your nephew's in New York, and you signed him up for a lease, and you've co-signed the lease agreement for his car. Right? You're really hoping that he makes all those car payments and doesn't run it into a tree. So, because if so, you're on the hook personally. No different than if you were the one who are driving the car and it's sitting in your garage. Very similar to selling the practice. And we've seen so many examples of that over the years where the doctor sold still has that continuing liability, and they're nervous. And that obviously, in some cases, has required the doctor to actually come back into practicing or taking over that lease, because they're now responsible for not only the back rent from your purchaser that is now defaulted or missed payments, but now you're also responsible for the remaining term of the lease or options. So very important that you're aware of what's in your lease, your understanding of the obligations, and I've just popped that up there, info@cirrusconsultinggroup.com. Shoot us an email right now. We're happy to schedule that in. We have had an unprecedented amount of requests over the past few weeks, so bear with us as we slot you a time. We are booking them through all 7 days a week. Let me just quickly touch on here as we've got some other questions. So when we touch on, if we discuss a rent deferral with the landlord, what are the considerations for adding those months to the end of the lease? Would there not be additional fees involved with doing this? So good question, Paul. So from that perspective, I think what the question is that, well, why do I need to have something documented, and am I going to incur additional costs? The short answer is, if the landlord is proposing a deferment or adjusting of the rent or moving April to the end of the term, for example, and all you've got is a pretty wishy-washy email from the property manager, that's a problem. You have to have something that amends the agreement that is aligned with whatever's being proposed, right? No different than an unsigned contract isn't worth the paper it's written on. So again, is there and can there be some expenditures from yourself by having someone review it, or having us review, or dealing with the landlord to negotiate, let it be a deferral, abatement, or otherwise? The short answer is yes. But again, you've got, this is amending your lease. Right? This is the likelihood of the practice to be in one location. And it's very important that we've seen some landlords put a 7-page amending agreement, or asking for personal bank accounts, looking for past year tax returns, personally and professionally, just in alignment with a rent deferral. So again, very important that you surround yourselves with experts in the field, specialists, to help ensure that you're navigating through this. Don't try to, negotiate a 6-page amending agreement, right, when you're not sure what impact it has, or specifically what it might be doing to change your main lease. So hopefully that adds some extra questions here. Some geographic questions. How do I know if my landlord's getting some benefit? In some cases, we don't. Depending on the types of programs or the locations you're in, or which state you're in, it depends. The short answer is that we don't know until we've reached out to the landlord with either a rent deferral conversation, or with a rent deferral wrapped with a nice renewal proposal to say, look, let's take a step back for a second. So let's say you're the landlord. You have 3 or 4 strip malls. You're getting phone calls all day, every day from gyms that are sending letters saying, we're not paying rent payments for the next 3 months, and throwing themselves at the feet of the landlords. Or we're seeing, the bars and the pubs and the restaurants that are saying, not only do we have no St. Paddy's Day revenue, but we're seeing very low revenue flow, and they're hurting dramatically, and we cannot pay rent. Barber shops, nail salons, sandwich shops, anything out there. So these are the type of phone calls they're getting. What we're finding is we can go to the top of that list by reaching out to the landlord to say, look, we're representing, one of your prominent anchor tenants, the dentist. We have a short-term capital crunch. We're looking for some assistance for May and June. We know there's all sorts of, packages or incentives to help business owners or landlords with some of these upcoming costs and fees. We're shut down. We need some help with May and June. We'd like to submit a proposal as to what that deferral would look like. And by the way, we all years, and we would also like to submit a proposal outlining the financial business and other clauses in the lease to align to that growth. So again, Maureen, from that perspective, lots of good conversations to help differentiate ourselves by being one of their best tenants. And what we're finding is we're seeing landlords, asking for confidentiality or other aspects because they want to negotiate a special deal for the dentist, because they want to keep you close. They want to keep you happy, knowing that as we reopen, right, that you're one of the more prominent tenants, that people are still going to need to have good oral care. Oral care is health care, and to keep you happy. Some other questions here. So some other questions about how the rent deferrals and abatements work. So, and the proposal to defer 2 months of rent and then pay normal rent plus 1/24 of the outstanding rent over the next 2 years. So yes, as we're talking about abatements, maybe we're paying half rents now. Maybe we're paying 0 rent for May and June, and it's deferred to be spread out equally over the next 6, 12, or 24-month term. So ideally, Paul, if we can structure something that avoids any interest and spreads out the payment. And if we're under a significant, cash crunch now, then yes, that can be helpful. We're still going to have to pay it back, right? And no different than some of the mortgage deferral programs out now. It's not, for the most part, you're still having to pay, and in some cases pay more in interest. So definitely there's a lot of ways of structuring the deferrals payments as we go. Let me see here. Happy to go through some of these questions. Lots still coming in as we go. I think they're all relevant, so happy to do one or two more and then we'll keep going. Advice if I've sent a letter and they've only responded with a SBA loan. So we've seen a lot of that, right? Some landlords, again, right? What do they have to? They're in the driver's seat. They negotiated the lease. It's all their terms and conditions in there. You're obligated to pay, and you're the one with that responsibility. You're the one reaching out for help. So yeah, some landlords are coming back to saying, when we're asking for help, to come back and say, oh, well, did you apply for your PPP or SBA loan, right? Or other government incentives? And isn't that nice? Or we've seen other ones that come back by saying, well, good news, we're now accepting rent payments in other ways. We'll do a bank deposit. We'll accept credit cards now. Good news, right? Oh, but we're going to charge you more if you use your credit card. So, obviously they are taking a complete opposite position, and they're not trying to help. They're trying to save face, but in actuality, they're stating that, no, you're responsible for paying rent. You will continue to be responsible for paying rent, and have a nice day, take it or leave it. So, my point is that, Bank of America, some of the major Canadian banks are offering lots of helps, line of credit or otherwise. But what we're seeing is, especially those that are coming up for lease renewal over the next 2 or 2.5 years, here's the way to cut through that. So rather than the landlord doing a boilerplate, hey, apply for a loan and pay me that way, there's another way of saying, look, landlord, let's make it beneficial for you as well. You need to show recurring revenue, and you need your books to show lots of receivable revenue for the foreseeable future. Right? I'm only committed for another 2 years. So here's what I propose. I propose a new long-term lease with options to help ensure that this is a win-win. Landlords care about two things: rent, right, and term. And from that perspective, let's play to that. Right? And now they need rent and term, trust me, more than ever. So we have a driver's seat. So if you're receiving and running up against Sanji, if you're running up against a brick wall, then, important, send us a copy of your lease, send us what you've been communicating thus far, and that certainly should be, we can certainly go from there in terms of strategy. Another great question. So here's one. So here's a great one from a doctor who owns their own space. So this is another great one here, that if you are owning or subleasing from a partner who's subleasing the space, that's a little more challenging. First, let's answer the one for if you own your own practice. So if you own your own practice, you might think, hey, this is great. I can just, pay one pocket for the other, and isn't that wonderful? However, you also have a significant mortgage payment. And if you bought that building over the past few years, that might be sizable. So now we have sort of two problems. We've tied up our capital in the building. We've built out the new practice and tied up capital for that. And now we've left ourselves heavily exposed. So for those of you that are in leases and think, oh, geez, I wish I owned my building, it can be as bad or worse based on, depending on how you've structured and how much debt you've taken on. In either case, though, it's very important that you have a lease. So for those of you that own your practice, very critical, and your accountant will attest, to make sure that you have a lease separating your corporation that owns the building from the corporation that owns the practice. It should be separate. It's important, of course, for, let it be taxes or liability, or to increase the value of the building or practice. That lease is critical to separate those two businesses. And especially if you sell, or heaven forbid, if you were to pass away, your estate will be dealing with a mess, because how many doctors can acquire both your building and your practice together right? Very few. Secondly, many of the DSOs, all they're interested in is your practice. They're not interested in your building. So your estate may have to retain ownership of the building for passive income, but then how do they sell your practice when your books are merged between using the same credit card if you're buying, plumbing and fixing a toilet versus, buying merchandise from Henry Schein? They're merged. How do you properly evaluate what that practice is worth? So great question in terms of those that are buying and selling. Another question about reiterating personal name versus professional corporation. What's better or worse? So yes, best, in my opinion, is to have the lease in your professional corporation. Have your corporation as the named tenant. Why? Because it adds as an extra layer of insulation so that your corporation is obligated to the lease and the term and the rent, not yourself and your house and your car and any other personal investments. So hopefully that's a good one. I think these are all relevant. I'm happy to continue to go through some of these key questions. In a medical building, property manager has been involved. They've told us to pay what we can, get the line of credits, etc. So we're seeing a lot of those. They suggested making reduced rent payments. So for May, June, and July. So again, if your landlord's offering some sort of a special deal or special terms, that's great. But if it's not documented, if it's not signed off by the landlord, if it's not properly amending your lease agreement, then we're leaving a very large loose end untied. And again, if it's the property manager, they're not the decision makers. They're just working as an agent on behalf of the landlord. The landlord still has to agree that your lease and May and June and July or whatever of 2020, and here's what we're doing with it, that has to be signed off by all, obviously by all decision makers and signing authority. So one final question here as we look through is, what about offering to let the landlord to use the tenant security deposit as part of a month's rent? Yes, we're seeing that as a good strategy. That's not a bad thing. You've already paid them the $5,000 or $10,000 of security deposit. That allows them to be whole for their books and basically use up money you've already given to them anyway. So that is definitely a good strategy that we've seen work to at least make sure that it's a nice, what we call an elegant negotiable. It's something that doesn't really have a cost on both sides. It frees you up from having to pay it. You've already paid that security deposit. And also then it gives the landlord the ability to shift that from the security deposit and then apply it to it for April rent, so they're whole. Okay, so that's a good question, and we'll circle back on some other ones through here. So let me just skip ahead in the essence of time. The lease ultimately is one of the largest paychecks that you've ever signed. It's important that you're negotiating it properly. There's 7 major financial negotiables. Let it be base rent, annual increase, common area maintenance, fixturing periods, free rent period, landlord work, tenant improvement allowance. There's all sorts of components that can be negotiated in the financials to make sure that you have a good lease in place. Another major one to be aware of is a death and disability clause and flexibility. Now we're seeing, again, uncertain times. Heaven forbid, if you were to pass away, right, in many cases, your estate will be responsible, or your successors or heirs, for the balance of the lease payments. Can they sell the practice without you there? What happens to the obligations in the lease? There's a doctor north of our office who passed away at 43 years of age. And unfortunately, that was 3 weeks prior to the grand opening of the practice. And just, again, very heart-wrenching. The estate was then responsible for the $10,000 a month in rental payments, increasing at 4% a year for the remaining 9.5 years on the lease agreement. So it's very relevant to ensure that you're protecting yourself. And in these uncertain times, all the things that we thought would never happen to us, well, here we are in a global pandemic, aware of the risks in the lease. So now, step 1, let's become aware of what's in our lease. Number 2 is let's prepare ourselves And let's remove as much of this risk as possible, because you're a great tenant with lots of leverage, right, to help ensure that this is improving. I mentioned a lot of these as we've gone, so I'll skip through these fairly quickly. Default we've touched on. They can ask for a larger deposit, accelerated rent. Please don't miss a rent payment if you don't have to. Make sure that the landlords agree to whatever you're proposing. There is no silver bullet, unfortunately. Lots of questions about force majeure. Typically, it's landlord friendly and still requires you to pay rent, even though we're forced to be closed, or government agencies, or the state or provincial or state of emergency. I get it. However, the way that the leases are typically written are very landlord friendly, especially if you didn't have any professional representation last time. And now moving forward, this is typically what we're seeing, that, you know, the force majeure doesn't give us an out, even though we're not able or we don't have access to the space, unfortunately. So what to look out for. So I'm going to spend a good portion or a few minutes of time here to touch on and how we can deal with these. So for those of you, again, with the lease in front of you, these are just some of the clauses to make sure you're clearly aware of. Again, the assignment. Can I sell my practice? And if so, whom can I sell the practice to and transfer the lease? Are there conditions that state that, like the lease I was reviewing yesterday, the new tenant must be equivalent and at the equivalent net worth of the selling doctor? So how many new, right, clinicians buying your practice are going to have the same net worth of you selling, right? Ridiculous. Also, the continuing liability. After you sell, are you still guaranteed? Is there a demolition right in your lease? That's relevant, because if the landlord changes hands and they want to demolish your space, and the landlord has the right within 30 or 60 days or 90 days or 6 months notice to give you a termination right, you might be 1 year into a 10-year term. But with a demolition notice, the landlord could terminate your lease and you be out. So we've had success with either adding blackout periods or removing the demolition right, or having the landlord pay for that relocation for us. There's lots of ways we've structured, but be aware of what's in there. Similarly with relocation, a lot of doctors have no idea that hidden in Article 46 or otherwise in their lease, the landlord has the right with 30 days notice to relocate your practice to any other suite in the building. And in many cases, the landlords will cover, reading this the other day, landlords will cover 100% of the cost to relocate the practice, not to exceed 2 months in rent. Oh my God. So we've seen, you know, doctors have to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to build a new practice, right, down the hall, purely because of the fact that there was a relocation right in the lease. Death and disability, we touched on. Surrender. This has been a big question through many of our lease reviews over the past few weeks. So, Eric, you know what? I've wound my practice down. I'm 2 days a week. I just want to give back the keys and make this nightmare go away. Look at your surrender and restoration, because it might not be that easy. For many of you that built out your space or have made any sort of alterations or tenant improvements, we've got a problem. Because in your lease, it may state that if you are to give back the keys and walk away, you may be responsible for returning that to pre-dental condition, or removing any of the tenant improvements or leasehold improvements throughout the time that you've been a tenant there. So that could be $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 of demolition fees, all because the landlord wants to bring in another tenant, or the new tenant has a different layout and doesn't want all the plumbing and electrical and everything in there. That could be a major liability for you on the exit. And if you don't pay, or if you don't do it yourself, the landlord usually can do it and give you the bill. And if you signed it personally or your personal guarantee, then you've left yourself exposed there. Overholding, never go month to month. If you go month to month, then it's important that you don't, because the landlord could increase your rent by typically 150 to 200% of base rent, not only for the month that you are upcoming, but also back bill you all the way back to the original month that your lease expired and that you became a month-to-month or overholding tenant. So that is very important, right? Very important that you're within term, right? Very important that if you are month-to-month, it is, please, when we request a lease review, mark urgent. We will prioritize that because you have left yourself very heavily exposed with, with the fact that you or the landlord can sneeze and send each other a 30 days notice and you're out. Right? And the question then is, what would you do? Right? If 30 days from now, right, we're now mid-May, we've just started practicing again, hopefully, right? We're mid-May and the landlord states that, right, you're out. What would you do? Who would you call? Right? What would it cost you? What sort of loan would we need? All of that should and needs to be avoided by having a properly structured lease agreement in place. We touched on personal guarantees. We touched on continuous operation. Many of you may be required to be open right now, right? And if the landlord hasn't agreed or documented something to the contrary, then we have to be smart about that in our next lease renewal. Quiet enjoyment, right? You should have quiet enjoyment to your space. If not, because the landlords, lock the building, then that's another conversation point. Exclusivity, right? Will you lose your ability to be the only dentist in the building or in the mall? Is there termination rights? Or now more than ever, does the landlord have the ability to ask for your personal and corporate financial statements? And we're seeing that a lot right now. Landlords asking for bank accounts, personal and professionally. In addition, asking for all sorts of other owner's clauses and documents. And why are they asking for it, right? Well, obviously, if you're coming up for renewal negotiation or you're asking for some rent deferment, they're going to validate that you are in harm's way. And if they look at your bank account and they see tens of thousands of dollars, that argument obviously gets diminished. So if you were not successful last time or were not represented or you have the requirement of having financial statements, right, and that was not something that the landlord removed for you before, then yes, the landlord may and could have the opportunity to ask for that. And if you don't provide those within a certain period of time, you can also be held in default, believe it or not. So these are just some of the main ones that time. Here's one clause that just states right here that if the tenant and has regularly paid its rent and performed its covenants and obligations and has not been in default. So again, this is the option to renew, the ability to stay in the space found in 90% of leases, where it goes that those options become null and void if you have been in default and or missed a monthly payment, etc., or have missed your option to renew deadline. So again, the cost of that mistake could be hundreds of thousands of dollars to have to relocate. No different. Here's an example of the assignment language that can be found in the lease. Here's an example even in the second paragraph here in the middle, just for asking to transfer the lease agreement and sell your practice. The landlord, I'm in the second set of orange here, the landlord shall have the either approve, right, Dr. Mary Smith to take over your practice, B, decline you transferring or selling your practice to Dr. Smith, or 3, turn around and terminate your lease agreement as of the effective date you were going to sell your practice and engage directly with Dr. Smith, just for asking to sell and transfer your lease. So again, let me ask you the question. If you're not able to transfer your practice and transfer your lease and there's no location, what impact does that have to your practice proceeds and the value of your practice? Yes, that could be upwards of 100%. So what's the takeaway? So guys, this is how landlords learn how to negotiate against you. Number one is they will defer, delay, and ignore your phone calls. So our ideal time is to start 24 months in advance or give us as much time prior to these deadlines, because the less time, the worse it is for you. The more time we have to structure, the better. So let's say in normal times, you reach out to the landlord, right, 2 years in advance. What are they going to tell you? Oh, Dr. Smith, we're incredibly busy. We have no time. You know what? Circle back in a year. It's too soon, right? You reach out in a year, what do? Oh no, we're golfing, we're out, it's COVID-19, there's no time, it's tough times, right? 8 months roll by, 3 months roll by. Now it's your option to renew deadline. You're now 6 months out. You must have a new lease or options to renew deadlines. You must exercise those options by that date. And the landlord's been coy and avoiding, right? Why do they do that? Because that's the playbook. That's how they've learned how to increase their profitability at your expense without increasing a penny of expense. Why? The longer that they can defer you from negotiating your lease, right, the better it is for them, the less likelihood you can relocate, and then, right, they can charge you whatever increase they want. Please, doctors, do not fall into that trap. Start the process early. Now, you might be thinking, Eric, well, how the heck do you guys do it if that's what happens? The net of it is that be proactive. We reach out 24 months in advance. We say, look, the doctor is incredibly busy with their practice and strategizing for the future. We've been hired. We're not brokers. We don't charge you any commissions, Mr. Landlord. We're here to help represent the doctor to negotiate a new 10-year term with 2 5-year options. And rather than waiting for you, Mr. Landlord, to send something, we're going to submit a proposal for a new 10-year term with 2 5-year options. And we're going to outline, right, fair and equitable financial terms, as well as we're also going to be submitting a proposal outlining some of the other dental specific language we want to see inserted into the lease. So now we've tugged at their wallet. We've now dangled that 10-year carrot, 10 years of receivable revenue. And that cuts through the people you're dealing with on a daily basis, property managers, agents, brokers, whatever. And now you get right to their asset managers or right to the owner because, hey, we've got cash on the line here and they have to do something with it. So starting early, starting 24 or even longer is better. So again, know when your lease expires, make sure you've got a professional resource in place, right? Don't get stuck to doing it alone because the landlord knows, you know what's the dentist going to do? I can just say no and then they go away. Right? So leverage the firm that does it every day, all day, every day. And there's never been a better time, in my opinion. With all this uncertainty, it's created an opportunity now that in many cases, right, landlords now are open to long-term renewals and securing you and commitment to that space. And that's a great opportunity to be resetting financials and to negotiate things in a non-binding way over the next 30 or 60 days or longer, right? As we're continuing to figure out where the bottom is, I don't want any of you to look back in 2 or 3 or 4 or 6 or 12 months from now and say, you know what, gosh, I really wish I took a run at the landlord during COVID to just see how preferred rents I could have locked in, right? And what do you think, right? Now versus 2 years from now, where do you think you would have the best leverage to be renegotiating? Right. So take this opportunity to focus on renegotiating now during this uncertainty. Right? What do we have to lose? In addition to that, new starts. Oh my goodness. What an unbelievable time for those that are looking at things as a glass half full to either be acquiring practices in distress or to build out a new location with all these vacancies and otherwise that I estimate are going to be popping up. Landlords are very aggressively trying to put people into boxes fast to shore up their vacancies, right? It's switched, right, from being very landlord friendly to now being very buyer, right, tenant friendly. Great deals on equipments and supplies, manufacturers. If you're looking to build out a space or buy some gear, great time. And last but not least, financing, right? Talking to some of the senior leadership at Bank of America on the practice management team, they say it's like 2008. There is lots of opportunities that for doctors that built out then got great, inexpensive construction, got very preferred lending rates, and obviously got very preferred lease rates, right? Those that were building or growing those practices, especially during those times. So needless to say, for any of you questioning what my rent or what fair rent is, please request a complimentary lease review. We have access to 95 billion square feet throughout North America. We can pull all sorts of vacancies, basic demographics, rental rates, comparables, sub-market reports, you name it, to make sure that we know what we're paying in terms of rent. Last but not least here, just to summarize, how do we do it? What do we do for success? First and foremost, doctors, next steps are, number one, get all the information. If you don't have a signed copy of your lease agreement, countersigned by your landlord, it's not worth the paper it's written on. So please request from the landlord today a digital copy of an executed copy of your lease, right? To ensure that we have a digital copy of the lease that has been signed by all parties, so we know exactly what we're up against. The original lease going back to 1984 or whatever, with as many addendums, riders, exhibits. Get all that first. Number two is now figure out what all our goals are, right? What do we want to accomplish at the end of all this? What do we want our future lease to look like? What do we want our practice to look like? Do we want to equip an op? Do we want to start to do airway and sleep apnea? Do we want to start to bring an associate in once a month, or a specialist once a month as a 1099 to do, you know, complicated extractions or endo? Those are certainly some main components as we look through. In addition to that, we want to review the office lease for risks. Have it professionally reviewed. Don't pick up the phone and call the landlord if you don't know what the lease is obligating you to today. In addition to that, get the market, get the data, know what fair rents are, and know what the strategy is before. And then also, point five, develop the carefully choreographed game of chess first, right, before step six. Step six is when we pick up the phone and call the landlord and start the process. What unfortunately so many doctors do is skip step 1 through 5 and say, oh, you know what, I want a deferral, or I want to renew my lease, and hey, you know what, let's just call my landlord and see what happens. Please don't do that. Right? Please ensure that you're going in equipped with as much knowledge and information as possible, because the landlord loves that. They lick their chops when they, right? A doctor calls up and says, you know, hey, I'm having a tough time. I'd like some help. What can you do for me? Right? The landlord now has complete control to say yes, no, or otherwise. Right? Much better to have a carefully choreographed approach to look at not only dealing with the short term, but let's give them a carrot with a nice long-term proposal. And outline what we propose in terms of base rent, annual increases, and other specific changes. Then what we do is negotiate all the financial terms. Let's get to the best possible time, usually 10 or 15 hours worth of time, negotiating base rents, annual increases, common area maintenance, et cetera, and then negotiating all the other business terms in the lease. And then we get to a final form lease agreement that you're satisfied with. So just to wrap up, I know I've gone a couple minutes over. Happy to keep this going for additional questions and otherwise. But ultimately, as it stands now, we have a complimentary lease review. So for all of you on the line, there'll be the ability to either email us at info@cirrusconsultinggroup.com, click the link at the end to fill out the form, or there'll be a poll that will pull up here momentarily. And again, in appreciation of your time, we will provide a complimentary lease review. And we will be coordinating that as quickly as possible. Please note urgent if we're going through that. You'll have the poll up in front of you right now. Please quickly select if you are presently a tenant with a lease today, yes or no. Number 2 is, when does your current lease expire? Within 12, 24, 36, or more than 36 months. Number 3 is your situation urgent? Right? Are you running up against a significant cash crunch? Have you skipped April rent without any sort of proper amendments? Are you in a month-to-month, or is your lease coming due in the next 2 years? Please denote urgent. We will do our best to prioritize you with the review. And last but not least, for those of you, again, looking, if you want a complimentary review, click yes. And then if you start or build or buy or relocate a practice in the next 12 or 24 months, click yes there as well. We're happy to schedule a call to discuss what that looks like and otherwise. Okay, so once you've gone through that, you'll then see all our contact information, where you'll see now our specialist, which is 1-866-739-9075, extension 3258. As my associate Carnell, who will be coordinating and putting this in with our senior consultants or myself personally to review your lease and schedule a call, or info@cirrusconsultinggroup.com, and we're happy to get a copy of your lease and help to support. All right, so I'll keep this open for a couple of minutes, just everybody to finish up through here, and then also to go through some additional questions before my next lease review. So from that perspective, let me just scroll down. What if I'm a sole proprietor? So good question. If you don't, and not a bad opportunity to be reaching out to your professional team. Let it be the same attorney that did your purchase and sale or other personal attorney in terms of the benefits, or your tax accountant or CPA. That might be a great resource to determining if now is a good time to incorporate. I can only speak about it from a lease perspective, that definitely having your lease in a corporation just adds an extra level of separation between yourself and your personal assets to your lease obligations. So now here's another one. If Maureen, if you die and are single, how can the landlord collect? Well, good question, but that typically falls to your wills and estate planning. Again, another great time that if you haven't done your wills and estate planning, important you do so, because your estate will then be liable. So the sale of your practice or any of the equipment or your assets, your personal assets, depending on how the lease is structured, the landlord now, right, depending on all those other factors, could then go after the estate, because it would be binding to your successors or heirs. So if you're passing it on to a nephew or a niece or a trust, then that is who would be obligated for the debt obligations. Perfect. A few notes of thanks. If I have, so here's another one. So if you have a lease already with terms, after the initial lease term, you advise to try to contact for another negotiation. So yeah, depending, if your lease is coming up in the next 2 years, that is a great time. The old rule book, though, has changed. So in some cases, landlords, we've seen 3 years prior to expiry. Landlords very anxious to help out and shore up long-term tenancy. So, don't be surprised if the landlord sees that you're 3 years out and they're open to renegotiating. We had one the other day, and don't think that just because you're 3 or 4 years up prior to expiry, that the landlord might need you more than you think. Negotiating near the end. So that's a similar question for 8 years now in my lease. I don't think this offers to be in the same time frame. So yes, if you're 8 years in, the question is what's in it for the landlord? And if we're not offering term or rent or some sort of a benefit, then why should the landlord open up the lease and make it better for it? Right? The question would be is if we offer more term or if we're flexible on some of the financials. But if you've got 8 years remaining, then yes, that can be difficult. I have a greater amount of operating expense. What should I ask the landlord? Well, the question would be is, first of all, have your lease reviewed, Pavi. If in the event that you are paying exorbitantly high, the question then is are you paying more than what you're contractually responsible for, is my first question. So read over the common area maintenance to define what you should or should not be paying. Another question is, do you have audit rights over the common area maintenance? Meaning that in the event of any issues or disputes, or do you have the ability for your accountants to look through their source invoices to make sure that they're not billing you more than you should? Another one, I wish I put my corporation or my corporation in for the lease. Great idea. So Alice, be careful. It might not be that easy. If you want to switch your name off of it and put in your corporation, well, what's the landlord going to do? They're just going to say, okay, well, good. Well, I still want you to sign a personal guarantee. So we've been very successful in limiting that guarantee or removing it in its entirety, but it might not be that easy. So make sure you reach out for complimentary review. Happy to discuss it further. So how would you suggest we reply to a landlord who asks for recent financials as a condition to discuss COVID and abatement or deferral? So Paul, that's a tough question. It depends on, first of all, does the landlord have the right to ask for financials? So look through your lease. Is there a financial statement requirement? meaning that in the event that the landlord can at any time request your financials, do you have to? Some of you may have to submit it to them within 5 or 15 business days regardless, or be in default. So you might not have a choice, Paul, to that question. If you do have a choice, then definitely you need to be strategic. And ask yourself, is it going to help your situation or is it going to hinder? Right? If we show a bank account or investment statements with hundreds of thousands of dollars in it, is that going to hinder the negotiations? So first of all, are you contractually required to give it to them, or is it optional? And perhaps, again, Paul, depending on your situation, if your lease is coming due, maybe we can avoid the need for a financial statement by dangling a 10-year lease renewal carrot in front of them to have them less focused about what you're at now and to say, I'm okay, but I do want some help. And in exchange of that, I'm going to give you a 10-year commitment. That is, in my opinion, a far better approach. So some other questions here about infection control, UVL, HVAC, etc. Yeah, I mean, we're contemplating doing a whole webinar on that. Lots of dental boards and associations provincially, statewide, about positive pressure rooms and all sorts of improvements to the space and alterations of who pays. That's a great point. We're just hearing little tidbits from different organizations, but dentistry is going to look different. And your practice, in my opinion, is going to look different as well. So in any case, the lease is going to dictate what changes you can make, what expenses there are. But if you're making improvements to the space, like adding new HVACs and new infectious control and air circulation and purification type systems, then a new lease with a new term and rent and negotiating for getting the landlord to pony up some tenant improvement allowance might be a perfect strategy to have the landlord help cover some of those costs. I already see lots of phone calls coming in. I will pause here and see if there's any other questions. And then I just covered that one, Alice, for other ones. So I think that covers the majority of the 28 that have come here momentarily. On that note, we will wrap here for today. Again, please, info@cirrusconsultinggroup.com, or after you log off, there'll be a form to fill out to request a lease review. Please take us up on that offer. We have a full team standing by. We have had an unprecedented demand, so please bear with us on time. Please let us know some optional times that work, and we'll schedule it right through Monday through Sunday. Happy to assist personally, to the chagrin of my young family, but this is our opportunity to really help the community and to help us get through this, not only survive and thrive. We appreciate everyone's time. Thank you very much.